Well, good afternoon, listeners. You are listening to Lament of Hope podcast, and I'm your host, Danielle Richardson. And I am very excited to be speaking today with Meredith Hall. Um, and to be honest, I came across her memoir without a map because I was looking to interview and wanting to interview people who had experienced um, traumatic events in their childhood and just seeing them overcome those and seeing them walk through those and how they did that and to share that experience. And a lot of that is in Meredith's Without a Map memoir. Obviously, she's in her teens, going into her adult years, but I think it's a pretty powerful story that will be really neat for you to listen to. And if you want a more detailed account, her book is on Amazon, it's on a lot of places where you buy books, and I think you would benefit from reading it. Obviously, we can't go into all detail here, um, but I encourage you to get it. And she also wrote a novel that I believe came out, what was 2020, right?
When he right in the thick of the pandemic, yes.
Yeah, and am I saying this right? Beneficence?
Beneficence, yeah.
Beneficence, okay, because maybe I've heard it, but I've never heard that word. So I looked and I was like, okay, I think I know what it means, but I've never heard anyone use that before. So awesome.
Yeah. Well, as I wrote the book, it was for the family in beneficence is the Center family. And I simply called it the Centers for the couple of years I worked on the book. My editor was concerned, I think now looking back, this was a mistake. He was concerned that people would miss the S and think C, the Centers. And so he came up with the title
Oh.
beneficence. And it actually is a word that I used in the book a couple times, but it is a strange title for a novel. So I'm not surprised that you stumble over a little bit.
And it's about a family who suffers loss, right? The loss of a child.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so again, so another book that is interesting and something you might want to look into, listeners. But Meredith, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time for this. I'm really excited. Um, and I want to start out, you know, it's been several years now since you were 16 and you were pregnant and you found yourself in a town where a lot of people turned their backs on you. Um, Do you, is there something you wish you didn't see about the world that you do now? Like whether it be some sort of, you think, deficit in your character or something that you feel has made the world more painful for you because of that? Like, how is the world different and you wish it wasn't?
What a great question, Danielle. That's a really, really terrific question, one I have never been asked before. Um, I was 16 when I got pregnant. It was 1966, and whatever younger people might think about the 60s had not hit small town New Hampshire in 1966. It was very, very much a 1950s town.
Hmm.
And when I got pregnant, I kept it secret for 4.5 months, managed to hide it. And when my mother finally discouraged, actually the nurse at school discovered that I was pregnant. And when I was sent home, I was expelled from school on the spot. And my mother kicked me out. And things tumbled apart right after that. She kicked me out without any plan of where I might go. My father, they were divorced and he had remarried, and I had a very distant relationship with him, but he did take me in. It was I was hidden in their house. Nobody knew that I was there and not allowed to go outside, not allowed to appear on the first floor when people were in the house, not allowed to make noise. And more than that, I lost my friends. I lost my school. This was a small town, and I was a sophomore in high school, and I had known these kids since kindergarten. I had been with these same kids for years and years, and I was a member of a church, and we weren't a tremendously religious family, but every Sunday we were in church, and that church community was very important to me. And because it was a small town, I felt very much part of the fabric of the town. And all of that was just blasted to smithereens. It all was lost in a second. And I think the effect on me in my life has been to become quite solo. I really move in my life in a solo way. I
Hmm.
have very rich relationships with close friends and with my children and grandchildren. But I look back and realize that it had a strange effect of sort of pushing me into a different world. And I think I would not have been that person if those events hadn't happened. I think the sense of betrayal and loss was very, very profound and had a deep effect on me.
Did you expect that to happen? Because, hearing that now, I mean, that's just, I don't want to say it's unheard of because it definitely does happen, but at the same time, it's so different the way it goes down for families now compared to
It,
then.
I think it is. I think my mother was oddly Victorian in many ways, and the 1950s were oddly Victorian. And her response was one of personal shame. All she knew was that I had brought shame to her. And there was no compassion at all. She was just enraged by me. And
Did you expect her to be?
I hid it all that time. And I think that I must have known that I could not rely on that. I had never
Okay.
known a pregnant girl. I've spoken to other people. After I wrote this book, a lot of women came forward, a lot, hundreds of women came forward. As a matter of fact, I just got an email yesterday from a woman who had just read the book. She had been trafficked and got pregnant at 15, and
Wow.
she's much younger than I am. And the baby died, or she was told the baby died. The baby just disappeared. I think that there are so many more people, so many more women than we know who have had babies who and have lost those babies to shame and but I think that it was a very particular time too. I think
Yeah.
before the Second World War, families would have held on to a baby that was conceived out of wedlock. And by my son was born in 1966, and by 1971, Roe v. Wade came in, and high school started. It was unbelievable to me. I was kicked out, and by state law in New Hampshire, I was not allowed to attend any public school in New Hampshire. The shame was that huge. And yet,
Wow.
years later, schools, probably not in New Hampshire in those towns, but across the country, high schools started developing daycare programs so that those mothers could stay in school. So it was just a really, really bad time in history for me to have a child.
Did you plan on having a baby or was it completely surprising
I
to?
was exceedingly naive. Nobody had ever talked to me about any of what might happen between a boy and a girl.
Hmm.
Um, a boy who was several years older than me, he was in college. He was a junior in college, and I was a sophomore in high school. And I met him in summer at the beach, and we were casual dates. And then I got pregnant on Labor Day weekend, and that was it. And he disappeared. That was it. So
Did you even know it was happening when you were intimate with him, or for you,
I
was it
I
like
didn't
no
know.
idea?
I didn't understand the risk I was taking at all.
Wow.
No, no.
How did it feel for you? Like when you became pregnant, how did you find out? Did you?
I missed my period, and the second I missed that first period, everything tumbled together. All of a sudden, I understood exactly what had happened and what huge trouble I was in. I understood the sense that I carried during those months, and then that led into years and years after losing my child and losing family and my community. Um, I carried just a profound sense of dread and fear and loneliness, extreme isolation.
Yeah.
I didn't know what was, I was shocked that my mother actually kicked me out. But I think I should not have been. A lot of girls who got pregnant during that time, I've learned since, went to homes for unwed mothers, they were called, often run by the Catholic Church. But I had never heard of that. And my mother probably would never have imagined how to arrange an abortion. And I was 4.5 months pregnant by the time the school called her anyway. But um, I I think I probably should have known what her response would be, but I was still absolutely devastated by it because she didn't offer me any option. I couldn't live there, but she didn't tell me where I could live or what was going to happen.
Do you think, back, in the 1950s, did people not talk about sex at
No,
all?
no. Do you know what my mother
Wow.
said many years later? My sister kept 4-H sheep in our garage and a little pasture out back. And I said to my mother, "You never told me anything." And she said, "We kept sheep. I thought you understood everything."
Oh my goodness. Wow.
1966. You can imagine. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because even I've spoken to a lot of different people just in various religious groups and various religious backgrounds, and a lot of people actually were never taught. They were either given a book or just kind of, or some of them were just never told, or some people it was just like, that's a bad thing, so we don't talk about that,
That's
you
the
know,
environment I grew up in. Yeah, yeah.
which is
My
crazy.
mother would say things like, she would be very scolding and shaming and say, "Never let a boy touch you." But I didn't really understand what happened if a boy touched me. I had no idea why that was bad.
Well, because you probably wondered too, like, how did I get here then?
Right? I don't know if I ever did. There's that funny thing. We live inside the world that's created by our families, and especially then, there was not a lot of questioning. I had a happy childhood, and I went through my days thinking that life was good, and I had my school and my friends. I was an excellent student, and very satisfied with being a student, and close friends and a brother and a sister. The world just went on, and um, I don't think the darkness, the possibility of darkness was just not something that anybody confronted or talked
Yeah.
about.
Did you, um, do you think you would have aborted the child if you had had the option? Because I know you gave the child up for adoption, right? You were forced
I
to.
did. My father and mother instantly made the decision the child would be put up for adoption. I was never asked about it. I was never consulted. Nobody ever once during that period of the remaining months of my pregnancy or for decades afterwards, nobody ever mentioned it. Once this child was born, I never was allowed to see him or
Mm.
hold him. And and I didn't know until I finally got up the courage to ask my mother when the child was 5 if she would tell me if it was a boy or a girl. I didn't even know that.
Oh my
And
goodness, wow.
so the child just disappeared. And the 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 secrecy surrounding it. It was as if my mother and father, I had to make arrangements with the father of the child to have him sign the papers also. And I think maybe because he was over 18, I'm not sure. But I had to sign and he had to sign. And that was it. And the baby was gone. And nobody ever, I was forbidden by both the doctor. The doctor said, "Don't you ever, ever go looking for this child. You will destroy this child if you do that. It would be the most selfish thing you've ever done," which I regret very much. And the rule in the family was absolutely none of us ever spoke about it. The issue of adoption, of abortion, is very tricky for me because if I could go back in time, absolutely, my life would have been rescued if I had had access to an abortion, absolutely, without question. Girls and women must have the right to make these decisions about their lives, and um, it was obvious, it was very clear, nobody in my family was going to help me keep this child, and so an abortion would have been a life-saving decision at the time for me, but nobody. I'm sure my mother knew that abortion existed, but it was illegal in a small town in New Hampshire. She wouldn't have had a clue in the world how to go about arranging for one. Um, but also now I met this child when he was 21, and he has become an absolute daily member of my life and his brother's lives. So it's very hard to say, talk about and think about abortion now.
Yeah, I can
So,
understand that.
Yeah.
You know, how that 21-year period of not seeing him, because you said, so I'm guessing what happened is you literally just popped the baby out and they just took it and it was gone and you were, that was it.
Mhm. Mhm. That's it. And as a matter of fact, they anesthetized me, which was very, very unusual by then. By 1966, they were not doing that to mothers, so that I wouldn't even see him in the delivery room. They knocked me out.
Wow.
I never
Mm.
even, I never, I was gone. I never saw anything, heard anything.
So
Yeah.
that 21-year absence, I mean, apart from just the rejection and discovering that all these people, who'd said they loved you and cared for you suddenly didn't act that way toward you. I mean, how did you feel different after giving birth and like never seeing this mysterious child that you'd carried and you'd felt for so long and then all of a sudden it's gone? I mean, how was that 20-year period for you in the sense of being a mother but not?
But no, that's really smart. That's right. Being a mother, but not. I felt as if I came in those months in my father's house to love this baby very, very much. My father and his wife traveled, and I was left alone in this New England house that they were renovating. And so it was very gray plaster wallpaper peeled off the plaster walls and just the gray plastic walls. And they didn't allow me to use sufficient heat. It was a cold, cold, exceedingly grim and lonely place, and they weren't there. So I was 16. I'd never spent a night. I'd never been allowed to spend a night by myself anywhere. And here I was alone in this on a little country road in another small town in New Hampshire. And that time with my baby created a bond that was very, very profound. So his loss was shattering. It was truly shattering. I was suicidal for several years afterwards and never actually attempted suicide, but thought about it constantly. And I had my brother and sister followed along with my mothers and fathers. My father, when I was 19, my stepmother, for unrelated reasons, also kicked me out from my father's life. And that stayed with me for my lifetime. So I had fully lost my father and my mother and my brother and sister who moved with that part of the family.
Mm.
The loss of this baby, and the losses were just too much. They were just overwhelming. And I I carried that for those 21 years, mourning as it felt as if somebody died. It felt as if my child had died, and yet, and nobody even spoke about it. Not only no funeral, but nobody ever gave me a hug and said, "I'm sorry, your baby died," and nobody even said your baby was born. You had a baby,
Yeah.
and um, and I carried this just devastating sense of loss for those years. Meeting Ron was both an enormous gift, an unexpected gift, but also very tricky for him and for me. He had an adoptive mother. He had grown up in a very, very difficult childhood. It was a very, very bad placement for an adopted child. Um, I was even after I met him, the grief for the lost child was never relieved. He was this young man, and he was my son. But I couldn't ever find, still haven't, even all these years later, I haven't found a way to alleviate the grief of having lost a baby. And so the effects are really profound. This is a devastating experience in a young girl's life.
Yeah. And you didn't, it's interesting because I'm thinking too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if, I don't think you can let go of a grief like that without being able to process, but you weren't allowed to because it didn't exist,
Yes,
basically. So,
yes. Yes,
yeah,
that's exactly right. If I had been offered some sort of ritual, some sort of closing, some sort of recognition, it would have helped me enormously. Yeah, yeah.
you know, when you were talking about being in the home alone with the baby, did you like sing? to the baby or talk to the baby or read?
Yes, talked to the baby. Yeah, I talked to the baby and felt by then he was moving inside me. And I had never known a pregnant person, incredibly. I had never seen a pregnant, never known, I'd seen probably out in the world, but I had never known a woman who was pregnant with a baby. So I didn't know anything of what to expect. I knew nothing, and including what a delivery involved. Nobody ever told me what was going to happen when the baby was born. But here was this living being that was part of me, moving inside me. And that was just an extraordinarily profound experience and created a very profound bond.
Yeah. You
I've
know,
often, I've often thought that baby grew in the midst of so much grief and sorrow, and that had to have shaped him in very profound ways.
did you want to meet him when he came to you 21 years later? Like, did
No,
you?
to when he came, yes, I took very seriously that I was a contaminant. If I tried to find him, I was a contaminant. Adoptions back then, this was a private adoption. So my doctor arranged for this adoption with one of his patients. And there would be no record. It would have been very difficult for me to access. It was the courts didn't allow mothers to find these children. But I didn't know that at the time. I believed that what constrained me from doing that was simply that it was wrong to do that, that it was
Right.
selfish to do that he had his life, he was loved, he had a family, and I had no right to intrude on that. When he found me, when he was 18, he started thinking about finding me. And
Mm.
he made an application to through a New Hampshire court, and it kind of languished there. Nothing happened. And he went back a year later and said, "What goes on with this application? Where is it?" And a woman said, "Oh, it kind of got lost in the shuffle. Let's reactivate it." And by the next day, they had found my mother. And a social worker, it was this, Ron was given a social worker, and she was given my mother's name and telephone number, which had not changed since I had lived with her at home. And social worker called pretending she was a friend of mine and was trying to find me, and my mother gave her the information. And that was it. All happened in 24 hours once Ron resuscitated that application.
Wow. So did he call you?
No, she arranged, excuse me, she arranged that we would write letters to each other through her. And
Okay.
so we'd send a letter to her and she would actually redact information initially. So I knew that he was in New Hampshire. He knew that I was in Maine. By then I had married and had two younger children. He knew that, but he didn't know where in Maine or the ages of the children or anything like that. And slowly we built to a point that she put us in touch with each other.
So what was
Actually,
it like getting that
I'll tell
first?
you what actually happened was that the social worker called me really distressed one day. It turned out that my son, whose real name is Ron, he was a student at the University of New Hampshire, and he met a friend of his, excuse me, who was quite a lot older than he was, but she had gone back to school at the university, and
Mm.
they met there and they were friends. And they met in the dining hall one day for lunch, and she said, "Whatever happened? I know the last time we talked a few months ago, you were looking for your birth mother. Did anything ever come of it?" And he said, "Well, actually, I have a letter." And he carried my letter in his wallet and he shared it with her. And she said, "Oh my God, that's my stepsister." And it turned out that my father's stepdaughter and my son had become close friends. And my father Ron was given into adoption into a very, very, very poor, very, very poor family in the same town my father lived in. And Ron grew up knowing my father and not liking him, not liking him or his wife at all. And and feeling protective of my stepsister because she had a terrible family life. And it turned out that was his grandfather. It was a very messy, very, very messy, very, very unconscionable for the doctor to have placed him in the same town my father lived in. Unconscionable. And um, so Ron had to work through this chaos of meeting me meant that it attached him to this man that he had reviled in his small town for years. Very, very
So,
strange story.
what was it like seeing him for the first time? Did you have some sort of physical reaction, or how did it?
It truly was joyful.
Oh,
The social worker arranged for him to come within a few days. She said, "You have to meet. This is too messy." And he drove up to Maine, and we went for a walk down to a beach that was nearby and sat on the beach and talked. But it was just an incredibly profound moment to see him, to actually. I remember the moment I heard in a phone call with a social worker, I heard his name for the first time, and that this unknown, unknowable, unreachable, deep, deep longing had a name. It was just a stunning moment. And then here he was walking up the walkway to my house in Maine. And we discovered in that first afternoon all sorts of commonalities. We were both reading the same book, an Annie Dillard book.
oh my goodness.
Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. We were both reading the same book at the same time. And within a few weeks, we discovered our alarm clock was exactly the same clock. Our toothbrush was exactly the same brush and color. And he had a girlfriend in high school. He was in college at the time that I met him. And he had had a girlfriend for several years in high school. And they dreamed about having a family. And they planned on naming their child Zachary. And Zachary was the name of his youngest brother. He named my child Zachary, which was not a common name at the time.
Oh my
There are
goodness.
very
Wow.
strange commonalities. We are tied, people, all of us. If our genetic connections are quite mysterious, yeah, for all of us. Yeah.
Did you, was there any anger on his part towards you or no?
I think that our relationship has, even now, years later, I think we struggle with his profound sense of having been abandoned by me and feeling anger that his younger brothers were not abandoned, that they got to stay with me, and my feelings of guilt. And I think those huge emotions move through everything. They're always there. And
Yeah.
we've learned to talk about them and call them what they are. And I don't know if they'll go away. I don't know if you resolve these. They're really quite primitive emotions, these feelings of loss for both of us, too, his feeling of loss of me and mine of him. And so we have built a relationship around those very primal emotions. And
Yeah.
we make it work. So
It's so interesting too, because despite your story where you almost you had no control, and yet there's still just that human loss of abandonment because you didn't do anything, even though you couldn't. It's so interesting how that still, that emotion, that feeling can't be helped in a way, you
right.
know? That's
It
so
is
interesting.
a child's sense of having been given up by their mother is, I think, one of the greatest losses. That your mother, that you were so worthless, your mother decided to just give you away. And my son understands that those were not the circumstances. I struggle with my own. I was abandoned by my family, by my mother and my father and my siblings, my friends, at the same time that I was creating a child that I was about to abandon. It's a very complicated story.
Yeah, but I know from what I've read that you actually reconnected with your family, didn't you?
Yes, yeah, over years. My mother, shortly after this all happened, by the time I was 20 or 21, my mother was diagnosed with MS. I was
Okay.
living in Colorado. I got far away from home, and I came home because I thought it was my obligation to take care of her. And she lived for another 15 years. She was ill, but she lived, and she in many ways was my best friend. I had loved my mother very, very much. And we never ever talked about this story. It never came up. It never came up. But,
And you weren't
but
angry at her?
I was, but I took very seriously that she was in a very compromised and pathetic situation. She
Hmm.
was frightened and suffering, and I believed I wanted to be a daughter who did the right thing. I didn't feel that my mother or my siblings had done the right thing, and my father, but I wanted to be a person who who lived by love. That was very, very important to me. You don't abandon people. If you love people, you don't abandon them. And I took that role very, very seriously and worked very hard to be a good and loving daughter with my mother. I think that after she died, inevitably, some of that anger finally I could examine it. But while she lived, I felt great compassion for her with her illness.
Hmm.
And we just, she and I just behaved as if the big event had never happened.
And did you stay with her for all those 15 years, or did you just come visit off and on?
No, she actually I became I didn't ever have to live with her to take care of her. She was sick. We hired a live-in caregiver. But my boys and I traveled an hour to see her every single weekend and often spent the night. And I cleaned her house and did errands and brought food for her, cooked food that she could eat. And I tried to take very good care of her. She was in a wheelchair. It was very difficult, in a lot of pain.
What is something about your mother that you really admire and maybe see in yourself, but then what's also something about her that you never adopted or never, you don't want to be known for that? Or, I mean, obviously there's this huge thing about what she did with the baby, but also is there something in her character itself that you loved? And then is there something you really just didn't understand, didn't like?
There was a lot to love in my mother. She was wiry and enormously energetic. She was funny. She was easygoing. She was extremely intelligent, had a high
Hmm.
school education, but smart. She was a reader. She was very curious. She wanted to be educated. Um, Her energy level was enormous and she just loved life. She took great joy in life. She was very much very as a lot of women were in the 50s, very very proud of home and was a wonderful homemaker. She had been a wonderful mother of small children, a single mom, which was very unusual in the 50s, really unusual. We grew up in the only divorced family that I knew, but she pulled it off and very resourceful financially. So there's a great deal to love and like in my mother. I think the flaw in my mother was that she did not know she was an only child. Interestingly, both my mother and father were only children.
Hmm.
And I think that it did tremendous harm to them and had great effect on us, on us children. Um, I didn't have a single aunt or uncle or cousin. I had two grandmothers and a grandfather, step grandfather, and that was the family. And I don't think my mother ever learned how to really love beyond herself. Her love was conditional. I don't think she recognized that, but her love was definitely conditional. And
Hmm.
that's something that I worked very, very hard with my own children to make sure they never questioned um, the constancy of my love.
Did you want to be a mother again after all of that? Because I would think, I mean, personally, I've had very hard upbringing, and so a lot of times, there's moments where I see children and I'm like, wow, that'd be so great to have a kid of my very own that you can like tickle and talk to and read books and whatever. But then you also are like, but I'm such a messed up person. Like, yes, I'm so much farther than I was when I look back, but I have
Mhm.
so many messes, and I don't want my children to have to see those messes and have to. What if I don't do the messes right, if you know what I mean? Um, and then they have to see that, or they end up growing up and they're like, yeah, I loved my mom, but, right? It's like, um, did
And
you have that?
generational trauma, we know now, actually actually affects our genetic makeup in our brains. It actually
Yeah,
epigenetics.
yeah.
It actually our genes change from trauma, which is just an incredible thing. And then those genes get passed on, those altered genes. Um, the You're much more articulate about your thinking than I would have been at the time. What I felt at the time, I eventually married when I was 27 and went into that relationship um, certain that I would not have children by choice. And I felt that all I knew was I felt that I would be disastrous for my children, that I would
Mm,
not be a good mother.
yeah.
And I had done so much harm to the child I had that I would do more harm to other children. Interestingly, girls during that time who had babies and gave them up, statistically, those would be women of around my generation. Statistically, 64% of them never had other children, which is pretty devastating.
Mm.
Um, and
You mean
uh,
of women who had had a child out of wedlock?
and
Yeah.
gave the child up, and the loss, I think a combination of the loss being so great, so painful, and the feelings of shame for being a person who would give away a baby, so painful that
Wow.
I think it leaves women feeling that they are not fit to have other children. They don't deserve other children. Um,
And was that statistic from 1950s or 60s, or you're saying
I would
now?
say they call it the baby train. That
Okay.
is called the baby train. A whole new industry of social workers emerged during that time that had not existed in the past. And
Hmm.
then those social workers were trained to remove babies from unfit mothers. And so we suddenly went from families keeping these babies under whatever circumstances, saying it belonged to an aunt or an older sister, or hiding it, not hiding it, um, hiding the true parent or not. But all of a sudden, babies were being given away. The Catholic Church, Catholic charities, and social workers, it was an exponential explosion in this field. And their agenda was to remove babies from these unfit girls and put them into adoption. And so we just went through this steep escalation of babies being taken away from mothers quite forcefully. I was absolutely coerced to give up my child, and that's the common story during that time. And homes for unwed mothers, you went in knowing that the social workers were going to remove your child, and that it is those girls as they matured who did not have other children. The shaming was just so profound.
Yeah.
Um, but when I finally, the man I married desperately wanted to have children, and I agreed to do that for his sake, feeling it was, um, feeling that I should do this for him, but I'm not good at this, and I shouldn't. We should pay attention to how not good at this I'm going to be. And the second I found out I was pregnant with my son, Morgan, I experienced a relief, a release of joy, a pure ecstasy of joy that, that has stayed with me all these years. So, and then I had another son. So, yeah.
And are you proud of how you've been a mother, you think?
Yes, that's a very nice question, Danielle. Yeah, I am. I think that I think by nature, even when I was a child, I think I'm an unusually trusting and loving. And I feel as if my heart was built to love. And I think that I love well. Um, I have not been able to protect my children from, I imagined when they were young that this terrible family fracture where I was not allowed to go to my father's house from 19 until he died in his 90s. Um, and everybody else did. So my children watched their cousins know this man and his wife as grandparents and they were local, they were there. So their aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents were all a very integrated family. And it was very painful. And I was not able to protect them from that. I somehow had thought that I would be a sufficient dam in that river through generations and it would not harm my children. And I was not able to do that. And I also am very aware it would be very naive and false of me to say that I transcended all these personal experiences myself and they don't have never experienced whatever harms and changes that made in me. Of course they have.
Yeah.
And they had to, um, I didn't ever force them to, but here was this half brother on the doorstep, and he was exceedingly compelling and charming and loved these little boys. And so it worked. But that was a big move for two little boys to open their
Yeah.
hearts to a new big brother. Morgan went from being the first and only child. Nobody knew anything about this. I had told my husband when I married him, and except for that, not a single person in our world knew that this baby existed. And here he was. At
Well, it
our
was
door.
amazing you told your husband, because I would think some moms may not even mention it to their, because I mean, you didn't think you'd see him again.
Yeah, that does happen. Yeah. I think it's not uncommon. And then if the child does find the birth mother, it becomes complicated because nobody else has known about it. But it's quite universal that these secrets are held so tightly. Maybe the husband is told or maybe not, but nobody else is told. So I had close friends who were family friends. We raised our kids together and they never knew I had had a baby.
Why
This
did
was,
you decide to tell your husband?
I think I felt that it was something he had to know. He
Yeah.
just, yeah.
And he handled it pretty well?
At the time, he was quite matter of fact about it and took it as, just part of my background. Never ever threw it at me, never made, it was not a good marriage at all, but that was not an issue that he ever used against me. So,
Mm. So are you single now?
yes, I am now. Yeah.
So was he your only husband? You never remarried or
I
anything?
didn't marry, no. I've had other occasional relationships, but I never remarried. Mm. Yeah,
Is
I
that
think
hard for you that you didn't really
I
like?
wish that I had not been single all these years. But well, I talked about being solo. I am fiercely independent and solo. And I joke, I'm not sure what a great bet I'd make as a wife anymore. So I am very busy, very engaged. I do lots of things. I have a lot of interests. And I think the marriage was so difficult and so unhappy. I think I came out of it saying, I just am not sure I'm going to sign up for that again.
Yeah. Was it more like, was it physically abusive or was it an emotionally
But
abusive relationship?
very troubling. Um, he was not monogamous in the extreme, and it was because we lived in rural Maine. I knew everything, and it was just very, very difficult.
Oh, wow. So he
Yeah.
had several affairs.
Many, many, many. I'm not sure I'd even call affairs and encounters. Yeah, it was a major problem. So yeah,
Wow, and how long did you stay?
we were together for 16 years.
When did it start?
Uh, right when I told him that I was pregnant with this child that he wanted so badly.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. What? And you knew that whole time
Knew,
that he
yes,
was unfaithful.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the lessons from my mother, it was a very 1950s lesson. My mother would say to me explicitly, it's a woman's job to make a marriage work. And I remember feeling confused because she was divorced. And what did that mean about her own feelings about herself? Did she feel that my father being a philanderer was her fault somehow? And so it was a very confusing message. But I
Wow.
so that was part of it. But also, I had, with the fracturing of my family, I had a profound need to hold my family together, no matter what.
Mm.
My family. my children, my marriage, they were not going to fall apart. I had lost everything before. I wasn't going to lose anymore. So I stuck with it way too long.
That must have been such terrible pain. I'm so sorry.
Do you know, it's interesting. He was an offshore fisherman and gone a lot. And I actually remember those years as being sort of not married. He would come home for a few days at a time and leave again. And those few days were always bad, they were always difficult. But when he was gone, I had set up a little homestead in Maine. We had sheep and chickens and organic gardens. And my sons, we lived on a little dead end dirt lane, and neighbors next door had two little children exactly the same ages, and they ran around in the woods, these wild little children, happy, happy children. And I was euphorically happy. I had my children and baked bread and made yogurt and sewed clothes, and it was a good life. And it was a really, really good life. My children remember it as being a very wonderful life. And I was really not very married. I could push it to the side because he wasn't there. I've
I
always
see.
laughed. I had been given a potter friend had given us four plates for our wedding, and one of them broke, so I only had three, and I always thought it was kind of a joke because I only needed three anyway.
How coincidental is that, huh? Did
So,
I have to ask, when you talk to your children about sex, did you use sheep or?
oh, no, I didn't. And I remember talking with him. It honestly helped because my oldest son had come into the family, and he was a logical person. They were so close that he was a logical person to just have this be a matter of course as the kids grew up. So that helped me a lot. I was very aware that I could teach my children how to be good people and loving people. I could model that for them, but I couldn't teach them how to be boys. And
Yeah.
so, um, I would exhort their father to be present and help them learn how to be boys. But their older brother really did a lot of that. But
Wow.
I do remember talking to them about their responsibilities sexually. That was really, they would say in exasperation, "I know, Mom, I know," but I made sure they knew.
Good for you, but you didn't use sheep. See, that's such an
Oh,
improvement.
isn't that hilarious? Absolutely absurd.
Well, I want to be respectful of our time, but I want to ask you one more question. You were talking about the Catholic Church, and I had actually just recently discovered that this was a thing, that this had been something that, and I don't want to just exclusively say the Catholic Church because there have been several, um, even Protestant homes that I've talked to where there was a very cold turn based on, someone having a child, not being married. Where do you stand with God? Like, was this to you like, I'm done with this, religious, anything religious is I'm not going there. It's hypocritical, which would make sense that you would feel that way. Or did you pursue your own relationship? Like, how did you work the religion into it at the same time? Because you experienced like spiritual trauma as well from people that were supposed to reflect, you know, godly values to you, and like it was really not that way. I mean, how do you feel now about that? Do you have a relationship with God or?
I have to tell you, Danielle, I've done hundreds of interviews over my two books, and you are asking very, very smart and thoughtful questions. It's a joy to have this interview with you.
Oh, I'm so glad.
An honor. Very, very smart. Smart questions. I felt the loss of my church very bitterly, the people in my church. Um, I apologize, my dog is barking from the other room. I hope it's not interruptive. Um, the uh, it was a tiny little chapel, an Episcopal chapel, and in a small town. I loved my church, and um, I was just I was pushed out. Nobody from the church ever contacted me, not one single member of my church, and I thought that they were my people. I thought I belonged. So that was very bitter. But I will say that by the time I was in my early 20s, I really started spending a tremendous amount of time in wild places, and they were just local wild places. I didn't know how to go any place big and exciting, but I would go to the woods and fields and spent all my time. I was alone. I was just solo all the time. And I had very, very profound experiences in the natural world. And the God that I had felt I was part of in this church, um, the hypocrisy of the church just crushed whatever that was. But in its place came something for me that was so much more useful and so much more home for me in this understanding, a really profound understanding that has stayed with me all my life. And it's grown with me through my life, of being that I don't believe in a God, a personal God who hears prayers and responds to prayers, but I do believe in a God who pervades everything, and in a mysterious, great cosmic order that I am part of, and that is part of me, that is in us, and we're in it. And I do believe that word beneficence that you mentioned early on, I absolutely believe in goodness, and goodness is godness. And I think the reason we are here is because we have a capacity to learn how to love. And um, it is the as we get older, the only thing that matters, even raising my children, I told my kids the only thing that matters is love. That's the thing that matters. That's the thing that will fill your life, learning to love people well and learning to find love and know how to receive it from people who can give it to you well. And then as I got older, loving something larger than people, loving, learning to love and wanting to love something that is far beyond individual people. And this is this sense of um, a kind of, I guess, a unity and a goodness in in the cosmos is where I live, and it's very helpful to me.
Yeah. I was gonna, I'm curious though because you've not been loved well by many people besides maybe I would say your kids, right? Those are the people who've probably loved you the
Mhm.
best.
Mhm.
Like, how did you learn to love people?
I don't know. I think I remember even as a little girl, I remember being I just seem to have been a little girl who was built to love. I just was a loving child. And I think somehow miraculously that stuck, that
Hmm.
stayed. It's I don't this is no um this is no virtue in me at all. This isn't something that I have to work at or remind myself about um or struggle with. I just seemed I was lucky to be born an optimistic person and a cheerful person and a loving person. And I went through the darkest kinds of years for many years. But as I grew older, and especially after my children were born, and I came out back out into the light, this person was still here, a cheerful, loving, optimistic person. So I don't think these aren't decisions that I have to make. I don't have to work at this. It just is.
Yeah, and you don't sound bitter towards your parents or
That is a decision. I think I choose, and I hope people will learn to choose not to carry anger and bitterness, because the only thing it hurts is yourself, maybe, and your children, other people you care about. It
yeah.
is um, shame and guilt and anger and bitterness. Um, they are almost weapons that can be used against us. And we have to just I think we have to make the decision. Your weapons are useless against me. They are helpless against me because I'm not going to participate. And I do think that takes hard work. You have to
Yeah.
do it.
No, I agree 100%. Well, Meredith, I mean, thank you so much. This has been a gift for me to get to know your story and talk to you. And I think your story is going to resonate with a lot of people. I mean, you already said you've received tons of letters, but I'm sure that many listeners will be encouraged by your story and learn a lot.
Great. I sense, uh, Danielle, that you bring something quite remarkable to your own relationships. You are really a very interesting and very, very attentive and thoughtful and sensitive person to talk to. So it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. You're gonna make me cry. Thank you so much, Meredith. Have a good day.
Keep doing it. It's very important.
I will.
Great. Thank you.